Chapter 4 is about how traits interact with leadership, or put another way, how traits can lead to effective or ineffective leadership styles and behaviors. And I just want to preface this chapter's topic by saying that we've already talked about how traits are a very incomplete picture of leadership effectiveness, or that is to say, they don't provide a very complete picture of how effective a leader may or may not be, because of the whole contingency model where you need to look at situation as well. So we already are starting here knowing that there is a weakness in the overall theoretical orientation towards traits. And that's okay, because you're going to see that traits are actually still important. It's just that they're not a complete explanation or predictor of leadership effectiveness. So that said, let's move on to the material. You see here this diagram that shows factors leading all the way down to the bottom diamond there, which says leadership styles and behaviors. The basic point here is that there are three major inputs to how somebody leads and what styles they use and what behaviors they evidence in their leadership. One is heredity, or what we call nature. You're going to hear about this nature-nurture debate a lot today because this is really part and parcel of what leads to your traits or your formation of traits. So heredity, your genes, ethnicity, gender, etc., things that you basically don't have control over because they happen to you. That is one body of factors that influence your leadership styles and behaviors. Okay. Number two is environment. And here we're just listing three quick things, but there really is more to environment than culture, education, parents, and physical. There's all the groups you hang out with every day, all your peers and your influences in the various groups in which you belong, whether they're geographic or social. That adds up to your environment. And so that's point two. Point three is the individual characteristics that we're going to get into today. Things like demographics, personality, values, and abilities and skills. Again, all to be defined in the coming slides. That's the focus of this particular module. So you put all these things together and out pops a leadership style with its accompanying behaviors. And so again, it's very complex. If you're going to deconstruct why somebody leads the way they do, this is really the overall model that would tell you these are the effective drivers of that person's leadership style. I want to get you comfortable with, pun very definitely intended here, this idea of the comfort zone and the zone of discomfort, which is the opposite, of course, of comfort zone. You've probably heard this term used a lot of times at work. Maybe your friends have talked to you about your comfort zone. Maybe your parents, who knows? Just this is a term that everybody seems to understand and relate to. The idea is that you function best inside of your comfort zone if you're doing things that are within your comfort zone, and you don't function well or at all when you start to do things that are outside of your comfort zone, which we're calling here the zone of discomfort. So the main idea is that all these individual characteristics that have bearing on leadership effectiveness, like personality, values, abilities, skills, and demographic factors, they have set you up to be comfortable in certain ways and places. Okay, and so when we start to move you outside of your normal personality exposition, outside of your normal abilities and skills, outside of your normal set of values, when you are hanging out with people who are not of the same demographic makeup as you, the theory goes that you're going to be uncomfortable, and so therefore you'll be in your your zone of discomfort. And so once you're in your zone of discomfort, two things happen. Either you can fail miserably, or you can learn from the experience and start to make your zone of discomfort more comfortable for you. And it's argued, of course, that effective leadership hinges on leaders being able to function as best as they can and learn when they're present in their zone of discomfort. Okay, because let's face it, there are just so many things that happen to us in organizations and with our colleagues and our organizational circumstances that put us in situations where we don't know what we're doing, or we're not comfortable doing what's asked of us. And so therefore, the only way you're going to get better is, the same way that you get to Carnegie Hall, as they say in New York, which is practice, practice, practice. And here you've got to practice inside your zone of discomfort, which means you're doing things, you're being someone, having a personality, exercising skills and abilities and values that you don't normally have. Last thought on this topic is this is usually a fertile ground for debate, and you may even want to mention this in your CRQEs this week somehow, particularly in the critique side. But the idea is that are leaders actually better in their zone of comfort, or are they better in their zone of discomfort, or is it a mix of the two? Maybe you have to have both. And so I'm going to leave that thought to you, because you shouldn't take for a given that leaders always necessarily need to be in their zones of discomfort. That's not a very sound idea either, and I'll let you think about why. So again, just please remember that we've said time and time again that having certain traits does not guarantee effective leadership or predict effective leadership, but it's one of these things where it's necessary, though not sufficient. Okay, meaning you can't possibly be a good leader in most circumstances if you don't have these traits. But having them does not necessarily mean you're going to be an effective leader, because it's also situationally dependent, as we saw with the contingency models. So let's go through some of these necessary traits then, and we'll define them briefly and talk about why they're important. 1 and 2 kind of go together, drive and motivation to lead. So you're driven to accomplish some goal, and hopefully that goal is congruent with the organization's goal. And if that's the case, or goals I should say, if that's the case, then you're going to be an effective leader, or you have a precondition rather for effective leadership, because you're not working at cross purposes, you're working in sync. Number 2 is actually really, really important to think about, because you can be motivated in a lot of ways. You can be motivated about the organization's mission, you can be motivated about the product, you can be motivated about working with colleagues, but the point is, if you're not motivated specifically to lead, then how is it that you can be an effective leader? And so that's a separate a piece of motivation that you have to specifically have, okay? Because there's a lot of people out there, they just don't want to lead. They find out what leadership is all about, all the problems you have to deal with, all the solutions you have to come up with, the creativity you have to have, the stamina, etc. All the things we're going to talk about in this course, and they find out, I'm not really motivated to lead, though I'm motivated towards other things. So you have to have that specific piece. Integrity, is honesty, basically, and fair dealing. Okay, are you an honest person? Do you deal fairly? Do people respect your honesty? If you have that, that's a precondition to effective leadership. Self-confidence. Nobody wants to follow a leader that doesn't seem like they know what they're doing. If you're not confident in your own ideas and the ones that you're trying to convince others to follow, then how you expect anybody to listen to you? Okay, they're going to look right at your inconsistencies and your fear of yourself, and your followers are going to say, well, this person is just not sure of what they're doing. They have no conviction, and so therefore I can't be led by them. Intelligence is a double-edged sword. We're going to talk about times when intelligence actually hampers effective leadership, but in general, it's better to have more intelligence than less if you want to have effective leadership for the most part. And the last one is specific to the organization and industry and field in which you work. You can't be a good leader unless you understand the business, and sometimes, by the way, taken to an extreme, it can actually hamper you once again, just like with intelligence. Sometimes knowing too much means you have entrenched thinking patterns about the business and the organization and the field, and so therefore you can't innovate, and that's no good either. But in general, again, having more knowledge rather than less is probably going to be positively related to leadership effectiveness. So now we move on to discussion of demographic characteristics. First off, what are demographic characteristics? Everything you see in bullet point 2 here, birthplace, religion, education, social class, gender, race. There's actually more to demographics than the list you're seeing here, but this is a good enough start for our purposes. And the main idea, and the reason why we even talk about demographics, is because it turns out research has uncovered the finding that most leaders are pretty similar demographically. That is to say, they have similar educations, they're in similar social classes, gender. We talked about male-female imbalances in leadership, race, ethnicity, even where you were born. So that's problematic. Going on to bullet point 3, because you tend to have a stagnant mindset. Okay, never mind the ethical issues associated with it. There are plenty. That's a discussion for probably a separate course. But here, what we're interested in is leadership effectiveness and how diversity promotes that, assuming that it does, and most of the time it does. So this homogeneity or similarity in demographic characteristics of our leaders is not really a good thing. And we can discuss why it happens, and I'm sure you've all got theories about that, and we've touched on that before in Chapter 3, I think it was. But the issue, again, is for us, homogeneity is kind of a bad thing for being an innovative leader, which is typically what you need to be. Moving on to values, there's a neat little definition there that we can appeal to. It says values are long-lasting beliefs about right and wrong and what is worthwhile and desirable. So every person, every society, every country has a general belief about what is good and what life should be like. Okay, so if I would ask you to rattle off what your top values are, you might say happiness, prosperity, stability, family, etc. And what you're going to find, again, is that 80% of those aren't going to deviate amongst people wherever you go in the world. 80% of it is similar. The last 20% is what defines and differentiates different cultures. And so not just cultures, but also personalities, genders, ethnicities, and even generations. So those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 factors or drivers are what do drive values and how people acquire and maintain their values. It almost goes without saying that culture drives most of what one forms as their values. So the two values that seem to be probably most relevant to leadership and followership seem to revolve around this idea of individualism versus collectivism, which we discussed before as the Hofstede and as part of the Hofstede and the Globe models that attempt to classify cultures. Briefly to review, individualism, of course, means that we care about ourselves as individuals. We care less about the groups that we work in. We have individualistic goals rather than group goals. And we talked about the U.S. being a more individualistic culture. Collectivism is the exact opposite, where we care more about the group's goals than our own. And so most of our actions and behaviors are for the good of the group or group-oriented. And so therefore, this is one major split in values that leaders have to understand and work with. This is typically, a cross-border issue where conflict arises when a leader comes from a culture that is individualistic and tries to work in a collectivist culture or lead in a collectivist culture. They are typically in for a pretty rude awakening, rather, and there's a bit of culture shock there. So you want to be sensitive to those norms. So this is a fun slide that just talks about how different generations tend to have different values because they go through life as a cohort of people, a group of people that is subject to the same experiences as far as politics and wars and recessions and depressions and all the things that happen to us in life that we have to contend with around us. So I won't go through each of the generations here because you can read them and they're in your book, and it's just fun to read about the different value systems and try to match them to people that who are in these age brackets. I am in the 30 to 40 Gen Xer bracket there, and so it says about me I'm supposed to be wanting to enjoy life, and I value autonomy and flexibility. So, in line with that, right now I'm thinking about how I should be in the hot tub and how I'm glad that I can record these lectures from my home office rather than the boring gray surroundings of my my school office. Just kidding, but not really. I thought I would throw that quick bit of humor in there to wake you guys up. But anyway, enjoy this slide and all the information. It's a fun study of different generations and what they value. And again, as far as the leadership angle is concerned, you have to understand these values when you try to lead people to see, again, what they value, and make sure that you are supplying what their needs are according to their values. Any discussion of ethics starts with the definition and differentiation between relativist and universalist views of ethics, and it'd be interesting for you yourself to figure out which view you espouse. Are you a relativist or a universalist, and which do you think is the superior viewpoint? The difference between the two is when to apply your own standards to all ethical situations versus when to apply the local standard to the ethical issue. So the relativist view says that right and wrong depends on the situation, namely where you are. So if we are in, let's just pick on a country here, Brazil. Brazil, bribery is legal. At least I think it still is. Last time I checked it was, because we used to do business down in Brazil, and we would have to pay customs officials to get our goods into the country, and so it was kind of a form of bribery. And so one could take the viewpoint that bribery should be unethical anywhere you have bribery, okay? And that would be a universalist view of the notion that bribery is unethical. However, if you were a relativist, you would say, well, no, if the Brazilians feel that bribery is just their way of life, and that's the way business gets done, then therefore bribery is ethical in that particular location, that particular country. But then you go to a country like the United States or France or most of Europe, and bribery, for the most part, is considered unethical. Okay, and so therefore your viewpoint changes depending on where you are, and that's why it's called relativist. Whereas again, universalists will always say bribery, if it's illegal, if it's not illegal, if it's unethical in one place, it's unethical everywhere, which also happens to be usually illegal as well. Ethics and legalities go hand in hand typically. So now we move on to the next trait under discussion, which is abilities and skills, and we, as usual, start by defining and differentiating. An ability is something that typically is thought of as being innate, whereas a skill is something that is thought of as being acquirable, okay, through training, through learning, different forms of learning. And so skills can be taught is the notion, whereas abilities or aptitudes, they can be taught but not quite as extensively as skills. It's more as if you are molding a piece of clay with potential already into something that you want it to be, whereas, you know, with skill, you're taking mud and making it into your statue because there's really nothing to start with. That's kind of the notion. So, you know, in America here, Americans tend to believe that people have finite limits to how much they can learn, and so an American before an Asian, this is what the cultural research has turned up, will actually think that they should be doing something where they have a natural talent first, and then forgetting about other things where they don't have the natural talent and have to acquire a lot of skills to make up for the fact that they don't have as much natural talent. In Asia, the cultural mindset is that anything can be taught to anybody if you work hard enough. So it's an interesting finding that the research has led us to. Under the subtopic of abilities, we have various kinds of intelligences. We'll talk about essentially three here: regular intelligence, practical intelligence, and the next slide or two is on emotional intelligence or emotional quotient. So let's start with the basic one, regular intelligence. What is it all about? Well, generally everybody has a lay idea of what intelligence is, what an intelligent person can do. Defining it more formally, it's someone's ability to basically problem solve and do higher level, more abstract kinds of thinking. Okay, so things like reasoning, things like comparing and contrasting, evaluating. If you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy of cognition, you'll understand the different levels of higher level thinking. We won't get into that in this course, but the highest level is evaluation. You know, when you can evaluate, Bloom, who's the one who created this taxonomy that's still in use, quite popular in evaluating different levels of thinking, says that evaluation is the highest level of thinking man can engage in. So, you know, problem solving, if I had to name the number one thing that leaders do, in my own theoretical model of what's important in leadership, I would say problem solving is number one, because think about it, you go to work as a leader every day, 10, 20, 30 problems pop up, and then you're solving new ones, and then you're trying to solve or resolve old ones. So intelligence factors into that problem solving ability. Now here's the interesting piece around intelligence. It's in bullet points 2 and 3. You'll see bullet point 2 says important but not sufficient for leadership, right? So again, as we've been saying all along with traits, having the traits will lay the foundation for effective leadership, but not necessarily achieve the effective leadership. Okay, so it's important or necessary, but not sufficient. And to take it even a step further, if you go to bullet point 3, sometimes intelligence actually hampers leadership efforts. We're going to talk about the theory a little later, but to spill the beans here prematurely, if your subordinates are in need of consideration behaviors, you know, emotional support, rapport, that kind of thing, then hitting them up with intelligence and analytical models and higher level reasoning and abstract thinking and conceptual approaches, you know, are just not going to be very, very helpful to those particular subordinates. So intelligence is useful in certain situations and not in the situation where subordinates need emotional support. Moving on to practical intelligence, this is, I guess the best term I can have to liken to this would be street smarts. Okay, if you're street smart, you don't necessarily have the higher level cognitive abilities, you're not necessarily an advanced problem solver, but you know about the practical things that you need to get by. You know, how to be nice to others, how to get them to do what you want them to do, how to be friends with other people, basically. And so these are all the elements, essentially, of practical intelligence. It's really intelligence on a more day-to-day kind of basis, basically. The last kind of intelligence we'll discuss is emotional intelligence, or emotional quotient. You see both terms used. This is a term that was popularized about, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago. You were seeing a lot of books being written on emotional intelligence or emotional quotient, and the key piece here is emotion. For the longest time, management and leadership was thought of as a purely rational kind of activity, where you were managing decisions and logic and reasoning and calculation. But then it turns out we had a revolution in thinking, and it turns out that we have to manage emotions in the workplace and in organizations. And, you know, really two sides to that. One is our own personal emotions, how we react or don't react to certain situations. And then the emotions of our followers or subordinates, how they react and how their emotions are regulated. So you have in your book an emotional intelligence scale that you'll be taking this week, and you'll see where you score on that spectrum of EI. What are some of the elements of EI? You see them listed here: self-awareness, regulation, motivation, empathy for others, and interpersonal and social skills. So let me just touch on each of these briefly and define them and say why they're important. And I'm going to actually lump together the first two, self-awareness and self-regulation. These are also are referred to as self-monitoring. You're going to hear that term used later in the chapter and throughout the rest of the course. A high self-monitor is somebody who takes note of where they are and adjusts their behavior according to the social situation in which they find themselves. Okay, so there are some people very good at doing that and others who can't do it at all or can't do it as well as the high scorers on self-monitoring. But the process of self-monitoring involves being aware of how you're acting, how you should act, and then regulating your responses and your emotions, because your actions are of course tied to your emotions. If you can regulate your emotions, typically you can regulate your behavior and your actions. So people high on EI, or emotional intelligence, are very aware of themselves, very good at regulating themselves emotionally. And that, by the way, regulation sometimes means magnifying your emotions. Sometimes it means diminishing your emotion. Okay, so it really depends on the situation and what's called for. But the regulation is the active state of changing your emotional state, magnifying it or dampening it. Self-motivation. You're a self-starter. You've probably heard that term a million times. Every job tells you they want you to be a self-starter. But what does that mean? Well, you don't need others to motivate you. You can motivate yourself, especially when the work involves drudgery, which a lot of work does. Let's face it, right? So nobody needs to be motivated to do the fun things and the exciting things. We need motivation for the less fun things and the less exciting things. And so can you give that to yourself? That's part of emotional intelligence. Empathy for others. Can I understand what others are feeling? That's what empathy is all about. So if I'm highly empathic, then that means that I have a good sense of what my employees, my subordinates are feeling that particular day, and I understand hopefully the circumstances surrounding those feelings and emotions, and then I can help the subordinate deal with the situation accordingly, since I start from a point of understanding. Okay, and then it moves into problem solving, obviously. The last one I think you pretty much understand without me telling you: interpersonal and social skills. Why a leader would need to have that, and why that would be part of emotional intelligence, I think is fairly straightforward. Our next slide on abilities talks about creativity. Creativity is one of those things that I think doesn't get considered enough in management and leadership effectiveness evaluations. That is to say, it is not thought of as being a key leadership trait as often as I think it needs to be thought of as being a key leadership trait. That is to say, its importance is understated. I'm going to put it succinctly. Creativity really matters in leadership because, let's face it, there are lots of things we want to get done as an organization that are just hard to do for various reasons, environmental and internal reasons. And so therefore, the way we get them done is by coming up with creative solutions to get them done, rather than relying on what's been done before, and rather than relying on patterns which may not work in new contexts. So creativity is absolutely crucial, especially for a struggling organization. And you're all MPAs. Many of you will, all of you probably will be in not-for-profits, NGOs, public service organizations, and so therefore these tend to be underfunded, and that means you have to be more creative in your efforts to accomplish organizational goals. So therefore, creativity takes on a higher degree of importance. But it's important no matter where you are. Really, if you're public or private sector, creativity matters. It really does. Anyway, how do we define creativity? You all have a kind of a lay conception of what it is. Scientifically, we can define it as you see here: perseverance when facing obstacles. So that's the part of creativity that to me doesn't even sound creative. It just sounds like, okay, you're steadfast in your belief and in your action. You're persevering, and so part of creativity is perspiration, as they say, meaning you just do the work and you muddle through it. Self-confidence, confidence in your ideas and your own solutions, even if they don't seem like they're working, which comes back to point number one with the obstacles. Again, you might not ordinarily associate that with creativity, but it is a characteristic of creative people. They have confidence in their ideas, and they sell them at all costs, basically. Um, Willingness to take risks and grow, 3 and 4 there. I think you understand why that's creativity. The risk is in doing something new that you haven't done before, that might not work, that will fail repeatedly, but you believe in. It's in trying out new ideas, right? Which leads us to the next point, openness to new experiences. New experiences bring you towards creative solutions and creative ideas. They are fodder for creativity, as I like to say. So things like, traveling, experiencing new cultures, which I recommend everybody do as often as possible, even though I know it takes time, and it's not the cheapest thing in the world. The more you can expose yourself to different modes of thinking, different areas of the world, different cultures, the more creative you will become, just by virtue of doing that. The last one, tolerance for ambiguity. So there are certain people in the world, they have to have certainty in what they do, right? We talked about uncertainty avoidance as part of the Hofstede principles that label cultures. Here we're talking about it at the individual level. There are certain people who are just okay with saying, I don't know if it's A or B, it's maybe something in between or neither. I'm not going to worry about not having a definitive answer right now. But I want to continue along the path that we're on, even without that definitive answer. Okay, and again, in this world of limited information and ever-changing information and environments, tolerance for ambiguity is a premium skill to have, really much in demand, and certainly a part of creativity. Time for us to move on to the skills part of the abilities and skills trait of leadership. And so remember again, the distinction was abilities are things that are more innate. Skills are things that can be learned or taught or somehow acquired over time to a greater extent than abilities can be. So now there's 3 different kinds of skills that we want to discuss here quickly. You have technical skills, you have interpersonal skills, you have conceptual skills. Forgive me for, again, reading directly out of the textbook. Every now and then, maybe once every unit, I will just default to the text verbiage because I think it's better than anything I can say. So I'm going to do that here and then actually put my own spin on what I'm reading. So it says, for technical skills, knowledge of job processes, methods, tools, and techniques. So, think about someone who's a software developer. They've got a program in Java or PHP or MySQL or whatever they're using. And so that's a very technical skill that very few people have. Okay, technical skills are things that take very specific kinds of training to get, and which tend to occur at lower levels of an organizational hierarchy, meaning the people who are at the lower levels tend to have a lot of technical skills, whereas people at the higher levels have the more interpersonal and conceptual skills. So let's get into those. Interpersonal skills, it says, knowledge of interpersonal relationships, including communication, conflict management, negotiation, and team building. By the way, you will take a lot of courses that deal with those exact topics like negotiation, conflict management. In fact, we have a conflict management course for you coming up somewhere in the sequence. So I think you understand, generally speaking, what interpersonal kinds of skills are. They're skills that relate to people, and again, that whole consideration, behavior, and emotional support dynamic we've been talking about throughout the course. Then you've got conceptual skills, which sound sort of like a cross between technical and interpersonal skills. The book says knowledge of problem solving, logical thinking, decision making, creativity, and reasoning in general. So to me, if I were to pick one word out of that list, I'd say conceptual skills really revolve around the ability to solve problems or to make decisions to solve problems. And sometimes these skills are going to overlap. In other words, to solve a problem, I will need a technical aspect of skill, I will need an interpersonal aspect of skill, and I'll need a conceptual aspect of skill to get the job done. So I don't want you to think that it's a mutually exclusive proposition. It's just that these are the way we label the different buckets of skills that people can have in an organization. This chart you're looking at is consistent with what I just said in the last slide, which is as you progress up the hierarchy in an organization to positions of greater and greater responsibility and power, you move from being someone who focuses on technical skills at the supervisory or entry level to somebody who's in a middle level management position, who's focusing less on technical skills but still some on them, more on interpersonal skills and somewhat on conceptual skills. And then finally, when you're in the upper management position, you've gotten to the top of the ladder, so to speak, you're doing almost no technical skills, you're using some interpersonal skills, and a lot of high-level conceptual thinking goes on in those kinds of positions. The next leadership trait we'll consider is personality, and we've already touched on various aspects of personality throughout the first few units in the course, and so now we're going to kind of formalize the discussion a bit more. First of all, what is personality? A personality is a bunch of traits that somebody has that distinguishes them from everybody else around them. So, to the last bullet point there, personality makes someone unique and different. Personality traits don't tend to change across situations. Okay, so there is a stability aspect that defines someone's personality. So, if you are kind and generous on Monday, but then mean-spirited and greedy on Tuesday, then with respect to that particular dimension, we would actually say you don't have a personality because you're too flippant. Personality traits are things that, again, change either not at all or very little across situations. And so, to bullet point 3 there, we have stability over time and across situations. Personality is thought to develop earlier in life, and the research that I've read has mostly said that your personality actually is flexible and malleable up until about the age of 30. Once you hit 30, that's the point at which your personality, whatever personality you have formulated by that point, tends to stay around pretty much the rest of your life. Now, everybody could probably cite an exception to that rule, and there are plenty of exceptions to any rule in this universe, but particularly that one. The point again is, what is the general finding, the general trend, is that after you're 30, it becomes much, much more difficult to change your psychological makeup with respect to your personality. What it basically takes is a radical change in environment to change your personality at that point. Okay? That's all I want to say on this slide. Personality really is a very complex way of describing someone. And what you're going to see if you delve into the academic research is that there are different ways to describe people's personalities, and some of those ways tend to get used a lot more than others. And we're going to look at the most popular method for describing somebody's personality on the next slide. So as I mentioned in the last slide, there are many ways in which psychologists and academics characterize people and their personalities. One of the most popular and most frequently used set of dimensions to look at personality is the Big Five scheme. And so just about any research report you read that's looking at tying personality to other things like leadership effectiveness, like brand loyalty, whatever, is typically going to use the Big Five scale or Big Five scheme for determining what someone's personality is. And what it is physically is, a bunch of questions or a bunch of scales that tap into how you score on the dimensions that you're seeing here on this slide. And you will, I believe, as part of your assignments this week, actually do a brief Big Five test in the self-assessments. So you'll see how you score. So let's go through what the different traits are. Let's start at the top here. Conscientiousness basically refers to how much planning and reasoning and calculation you tend to do. So if you do more of that, you're more conscientious according to Big Five. Number 2, extroversion, introversion. Most people already know what that means. Briefly, it basically means how sociable and talkative and willing to connect with other people you are. Okay, extroverts do that a lot. Introverts pretty much keep to themselves. And just, briefly, I want to mention an interesting theory that explains, or tries to explain, not everybody agrees with this, but it tries to explain why one evinces extroverted or introverted tendencies. The thought goes like this. It's all about your internal set point for stimulation. A researcher, psychologist, who goes way back to almost the beginnings of modern personality psychology, his name is Eysenck, said that if you are somebody who craves a lot of stimulation because your set point for stimulation is very high, which means, again, you're needing stimulation, but you don't get it because your expectation, your mental expectation is that you are expecting a lot of stimulation, then you tend to be extroverted. So you talk to other people, you join groups, you go to parties, you are more social because you're trying to satisfy that need of being stimulated, because your set point for stimulation is very high. So, the interesting thing about extroverts is that, according to this theory, extroverts are chronically understimulated. It's exactly the opposite of what you might think. Okay. Introverts, on the other hand, according to Eysenck, are overstimulated. So their set point tends to be low for stimulation, and so therefore, the littlest thing, the littlest social contact, maybe even reading a book, by themselves, is enough to stimulate them and keep them engaged. And so therefore, when they're around too many people who are doing too much talking and they're doing too much talking to those people, then introverts feel overstimulated. Again, not everybody agrees with this theory. There are other theories that explain the differences between introverts and extroverts. But I thought I would just bring this one to your attention because I find it personally interesting. Moving on, openness to experience. Do you like to travel? Do you like to learn about new cultures and ideas, etc.? We've talked about this variable before in the Hofstede Globe framework. Emotional stability. This used to be called neurotic behavior, or something relating to being neurotic. Okay. What happened was that the clinicians and psychologists, research psychologists of the world, decided they didn't want to call people neurotic because that is typically associated with having a psychological stigma attached to you. Whereas really what the psychologist meant by neurotic was simply that you tend to worry and be anxious a lot about a lot of different things frequently. And then people took the word neurotic and made it into more than it really was. So they changed the name to emotional stability. And so if you're emotionally stable, basically you don't do a lot of worrying, you're not always anxious, you tend to be pretty level-headed, and that's what emotional stability tries to capture. The last one is agreeableness. It's you go out with your friends to eat, and they want Chinese, and you say, no, we're going to have Greek, and they say, okay, we'll do Greek, but then you get into an argument about what kind of Greek food or something like that. So the point is, neither of you are really being all that agreeable. Whereas if your friends say, let's do Greek, and you say, yes, we'll do Greek, then you would be agreeable, just to use a restaurant example there. How much do you tend to agree with your peers versus either contradict or disagree with them. A specific personality trait we'll discuss now is type A versus type B personality. If we spend our time defining type A, then type B just kind of falls into place because it's the opposite of type A. And I'm pretty sure that most of you have probably already heard about type A kinds of people. Basically, what goes on with type A kinds of people is that they are control freaks, for lack of a better word. And I'm not passing judgment. I'm just kind of telling you how the research psychologists have classified people according to their need for control. So if you need a lot of control, typically an excessive amount of control, then you tend to be a type A kind of a person. Okay, and so there's essentially 4 defining characteristics that stem from that need for control, and that also help label people as type A. So you see them there in the middle in the blue. Time urgency, again, type A people are always in a rush. They never have enough time. They never perceive that they have enough time. But whether or not they do is irrelevant. Have enough time. It's that they always think they're short on time. So what that does is it leads to this thing called polyphasic behaviors, where they're doing multiple things at once, multitasking essentially, rather than working on one thing at a time. Even though, by the way, you may have heard the recent research that people really can't multitask. They can think that they multitask, but when it comes down to reality, you actually can't multitask. Your brain can only work on one thing at a time. So it's actually a myth that we multitask, although what's really going on in most of these cases, or all of these cases, is that you are just switching quickly between tasks when you think you're multitasking. But that also typically leads to decreased performance on each task, believe it or not. So that's polyphasic behaviors. Poly, of course, means many. Phasic is phases. Many phase behaviors, meaning you multitask and try to do many things at once. Competitiveness, I probably don't have to define. You are always trying to get on top, so that's all I'll say there. And then a lot of this leads to hostility, especially when type A's work with people they perceive to be incompetent or not working fast enough or not caring enough. You will see hostile behavior, hostility coming from type A kinds of leaders and colleagues. Specific work-related behaviors you see down on the bottom. Type A's don't delegate. They just hate doing it because they think they can do it better, and they get frustrated by the incompetence of those they delegate to. So that kind of goes along with point number 2. They want to work alone. They don't want to work with other team members because, again, they feel the team members will slow them down and do things wrong and won't care as much as they do. They don't do a lot of planning. They tend to jump right into action, and they figure they will plan later or maybe not at all if things are going well. And you know how disastrous that can be. I'm sure you've been in a situation where you haven't planned and then everything went wrong because you didn't anticipate this or that particular thing happening in the middle of your process, which if you had planned, you would have had a contingency step for that. They tend to set lofty goals. I think that one's pretty straightforward. They're hardworking, hard-driving people, and their stress levels are always higher than their counterparts, which are the type B people. So type B people don't need as much control. They're not quite as competitive. They don't do polyphasic behaviors. Essentially the opposite of what you're seeing here in just about every aspect. Can you have some type A tendencies and some type B tendencies? Yes. I am a perfect example of that. As I sat down to evaluate myself, I found out that I'm kind of in between. Some days I show type A characteristics. Some day I'm a type B kind of a person. So interesting to see how you rank on the scale you're going to take. See if you're a type A or a type B kind of a person. And just again, understand here that there are leaders out there that are type A and there are leaders that are type B, and your text discusses when that works meaning when being a type A is better and when it's not. Generally speaking, type B leaders tend to do a little better because the type A's wind up getting too many people angry with them when they're too impatient. So I think there is a small to moderate advantage to being a type B leader, depending again on the situation you find yourself in. That's been the constant theme in this course. So now we come to the concept of self-monitoring. We've touched on this subject a number of times, whether I explicitly stated so before or not. Let's first talk about, or review really, what a self-monitor is and what self-monitoring is. This is a behavior that describes someone who's very good at sensing the state of their environment and reacting to the state of that environment appropriately. Okay, so let me give you a quick example. Have you ever tried to tell a joke and nobody laughed? And the joke was funny, but the reason why nobody laughed was because you made a joke in a situation where everybody was in sort of a serious mental state. Okay, it just doesn't work. You know, if people are going to laugh at a joke, they need to be in a mental state that is conducive to laughing. And so the low self-monitor doesn't pick up on the fact that others in the room are not in the mood for their joke. Okay, and that's just one example. There are tons of others, but the point is, self-monitoring is about looking out and seeing what people are feeling, or at least sensing what they're feeling from their oral and nonverbal communication patterns. You know, so I can look at your body language. I can also hear what you're saying. And I can render a judgment as to what you're feeling and therefore adjust my behavior to accommodate your mental state and your emotional state. Okay, so high self-monitors do that well, and they change their behavior to match the situation, which also means they're more comfortable in new situations than the low self-monitors. Because typically what happens is the low self-monitors, they'll make their joke or they'll do their thing without attending to the environmental cues, and then they get negative reactions from the people they deal with, so that, you know, when you have a negative dealing with somebody, what do? You withdraw, you get angry, upset, whatever, and it's not a pleasant experience. So the self-monitor just avoids that altogether by being attentive to those environmental cues. Okay. Also better for dealing in cross-cultural situations. And again, nowadays in leadership, this is more the norm that you're going to be doing that. So, you know, all this put together leads to the very general statement and finding that you want to be an effective leader. You pretty much tend to need to be a high self-monitor, be good at self-monitoring, which again means that you're very attentive to the environmental cues. You essentially know what people are thinking and feeling without having to do too much direct questioning. And so therefore you can match your tone and your style with the general mood state and the psychological needs of your followers and colleagues. Okay, so this is very much consistent with the contingency models that talk about, yes, you have your traits, but then there's the situation, and if the traits don't match up to the need of the situation, then you don't have effective leadership. So therefore, self-monitoring is a skill that helps you do that matching very appropriately. Okay, down the home stretch with just 3 slides left in Chapter 4. The next 2 slides are kind of fun, I have to admit, because they talk about Machiavellianism and narcissism. So let's start with Machiavellian personality. You know, like all these traits that we're talking about, there are scales to measure them, and the one that measures Machiavellian personality is the Machiavellian scale, or the Mach scale. There's also another scale called the F scale, which is similar and purports to measure essentially the same thing. So if you hear those 2 terms, it's those are the instruments that measure this personality trait. Now, what's a high versus a low Mach? Well, if you're a high Mach, you have a Machiavellian personality. Remember what Machiavelli said. He said the ends justify the means. That was the whole basis for his novel, The Prince. And so a high mock is going to be someone who believes the end justifies the means. Which means, of course, that you can do anything you want to do to get, or you should do anything that you can and want to do to get to the end point that you want to get to. Practically speaking, it means that the 3 bullet points you see here. High mocks are very good at controlling other people. They resist being controlled, and they know when somebody's trying to control them. And that's not, by the way, so easy to do all the time. A lot of people just don't have any idea, or either that or they don't care when they're being controlled. High mocks are very sensitive to it. And by the way, one thing is I'm going to throw in here. It's not listed. High mocks are actually very good at submitting when they know it's in their best interest to attain more power. So in other words, if submitting to a higher authority would get you yourself more power, a high mock will be quicker to do that than a low mock. So on the one hand, even though they are better at resisting manipulation, they actually capitulate a lot quicker in situations in which they know that they're relatively weak, more so than low mocks. Okay, sorry, 3rd bullet point, they tend to do better in unstructured situations with few rules because they make the rules and they create the manipulation to satisfy their own goals and endpoints and needs. So a low mock, is exactly the opposite of the high mock, of course, and the problem with being a low mock is you're too naive and you're too trusting and you're too easily manipulated, so that you're not a good leader if you're a low mock. You're not a good leader if you're a high mock, because typically these kinds of people are the ones that maybe they wind up accomplishing a goal, but they get everybody angry with them. They tire out their staff, their colleagues, their followers. The followers are waiting for them to fail, for somebody to take their place, because the high mock is manipulating them and making them work too hard for the high mock's benefit. That's the thing with the high Machiavellian personality, is that all of this manipulation is in service of the goals of the Machiavellian individual and not the organization, right? Organizations hire people to lead for the organization's sake, to accomplish organizational goals, but here the high mock is coming in and basically acting like a virus and redirecting production and productivity in the direction of his or her own needs as opposed to those of the organization. So high mocks eventually will get ferreted out of a system, either through firing or demotion or something like that. Low mocks won't make it either, because they just don't have the influence personality that they need to help their followers succeed. You have to be influential. You have to have confidence. You have to resist being manipulated the wrong way if you want to succeed. And so low mocks can't do that. So the moral of the story is the blue point, blue writing rather, at the bottom of the slide, which is that effective leadership tends to be associated with a moderate Machiavellian personality. So someone who scores right in the middle of the scale that you're going to take as part of your self-assessment exercises this week. A factor that seems somewhat similar to Machiavellian personality is the narcissistic personality. They are different, though. You need to understand at the outset that we're measuring or tapping two different but sometimes correlated phenomena here. Whereas the Machiavellian is primarily concerned about manipulating others to satisfy his or her own needs, the narcissist is really more about being the center of attention for themselves. Whether or not that leads to manipulation and achieving one's own goals is in some ways irrelevant to the narcissistic personality's mental makeup. Okay, so that is to say, it's really more about just being the center of attention than it is about manipulating people. So you see there in big bold type, narcissistic personality has two major dimensions. One is feelings of grandiosity, the I'm great syndrome, and I'm much better than you. And then the second is the sense of entitlement, which means that everything should come my way kind of thinking. So a lot of these are kind of obvious. Preoccupation with power, I think you understand that. Self-importance, I think you probably understand. Typically narcissists are arrogant. But really what all these things revolve around is a focus on the self. Self-absorption, indifference to others, okay, being the center of attention at all times. This is all self-centered behavior. Okay, and the one that seems to overlap with Machiavellian is the exploitation of others to achieve goals. But again, these are separate constructs and separate concepts. Narcissistic and Machiavellian do not attempt to describe essentially the same thing. Excessive narcissism, not good for leadership, because again, you run into this problem of the narcissist only thinks of him or herself. All of his or her behaviors are directed towards feeding the narcissism, and so high narcissistic personality types will fail as leaders. Okay, we as a society have becoming more narcissistic. Your book talks about a study of college-age students showing more narcissism lately. I tend to agree. It's probably true. One of the things that's driving it is social media, in particular Facebook. In fact, there's been tons of studies done on Facebook usage and narcissism, and it turns out those who are on Facebook tend to be more narcissistic than those who are not using Facebook or not using Facebook as frequently, because pretty much everybody's using Facebook these days. Same pretty much goes for Twitter, although the dynamic's a little bit different. So the social media is driving a lot of this narcissism because it's giving you the avenues to display and feed the narcissism and get responses to it from others, of course, which is what the narcissist wants. So we close this chapter with quickly looking at characteristics of leaders who tend to fail. We're going to come back to this issue when we talk about corruption and power and then ethics towards the end of the course, but this is a neat little introduction to a situation that, of course, you hope you never find yourself in, either on the giving or receiving end of leadership. So I'm not going to cover the points that are more obvious, like being intimidating. Everybody could understand why an intimidating boss is somebody who's going to eventually fail. Let's talk about the less obvious things like being political, which is your bullet point 4, or at least part of bullet point 4. What does being political mean? Now, you hear that term a lot. Oh, he or she is very political, or it's politics that drives that decision. What the heck does that mean? I used to hear that again and again in my organizational environments. I never really knew what to make of it, so I decided that when I was going to talk about it in class, I would, for the sake of anybody who was wearing the same shoes as me and not understanding what political meant, let's delve into it and explore it a little bit. So to me, political means that decisions are made on bases other than skill and what the right decision-making bases should be for any given decision. So I talk about skill. Who do you hire for the job? Who do you put on the project? Who do you put in charge of leading this particular project? Well, the person that's got the right skill and temperament, okay? But a political decision would be, well, I'm putting my friend or somebody who's treated me well, because we have a reciprocity arrangement between the two of us, into that position, rather than the person who's best qualified for the job, right? So it really comes down to a matter of qualifications versus other factors, and that's what distinguishes a political decision from a quality decision. Typically, political decisions are not terribly good ones, but they can be. Sometimes you get lucky, and sometimes politics can actually, and this is a rare case, political thinking can actually be somewhat beneficial. But again, it's hard to find examples of when that's true. So political maneuvering is really to be avoided if you want to be a successful leader. The best leaders are apolitical, or as apolitical as they can be. The last one, unable to delegate or inability to delegate. Again, there's only so much you can do or should do as a leader. If you're not able to hand off the work to somebody else, and there are various reasons why that happens, which we'll get into later, then you're just not leading. You're just doing all the work, and you're stealing growth and development opportunities from your subordinates and followers. So it's not leadership at all, and it's certainly not good leadership.